In this video, I want to take some time to talk about why we trade, and particularly link that why we trade question to the theory behind absolute and comparative advantage. In essence, why does international trade generate so much controversy? Why do people come out in the streets and regularly fight the police, throw Molotov cocktails, all over trade liberalization? And what is the theory behind it? And so we want to take a few minutes and talk a little bit about what the theory is, and also toward the end, talk about some of the politics and really highlight some of the gaps and perhaps shed some light on the understanding behind why we end up with such controversy and violence sometimes in the streets regarding trade liberalization. Some of this discussion about why we trade has to begin with parts of the neoclassical economic model, which at its essence is really about the distribution of scarce resources or choice under constraint. What is the optimal or most efficient way in which we can allocate our productive resources to produce consumer goods, capital goods, and so on? And part of it also is, if a liberal open economy makes so much sense, why has trade been such a tough sell politically? Well, first, this diagram, this image depicts what's called a production possibilities curve. And the basic premise here, in the two curved lines that you see here, is that a country is constrained by its resources, whether it's labor, capital, natural resources, in the production of goods. What can it actually produce, given its allocation of resources, given its allocation of labor, et cetera, et cetera? And so the question for countries, and one of the big rationales for why we trade, is how can a country move from one production possibilities curve to a higher ordinal of a production possibilities curve? In other words, how can it break free from the constraints imposed on it by its limited finite resources? Well, the answer there is trade. If you want, in this diagram, more capital and consumer goods, and you want to move away from a particular constraint, a production possibilities curve that you're constrained by, how do you do that? You trade. That way you can get to the next production possibilities curve by getting goods from other countries that you don't produce very well yourself. One major challenge in moving towards a more open, liberalized trading regime is the mere fact that there are aspects of international trade that are anchored in a lot of false beliefs. One of the early doctrines of international trade was something called mercantilism, familiar to probably a lot of you. But it is rooted in the idea that exports were good and imports were bad. Intuitively, this could make a little bit of sense to some people. On the one hand, exports, you produce lots of value-added jobs at home, manufacturing exports for sale abroad. Those value-added jobs and value-added products you send abroad, foreigners pay for them. Capital flows into your country because they're paying for them. You purchase raw materials from abroad at lower cost that go into those manufactured goods. And so there's a cycle of exports good, imports bad. The more imports you are bringing in from outside, the more money you're paying foreigners for those imports. Whereas exports, there's this intuitive sense that others are paying you more money for your products than you are paying them. And so under mercantilism, there was this preference, this deference to exports, a positive export balance that was very, very difficult to overcome because of its intuitive qualities. Again, because national wealth became tied to this idea of exports going out, foreigners paying for them, and lots of capital flowing into your country, there was this idea that trade was connected to wealth generation in your own country, but mostly only if you had a positive export balance. You were earning more income from the exports, sale of your exports abroad, than you were paying to foreigners for their stuff. One of the big challenges with mercantilism, however, is inflation. As pointed out by David Hume, inflation results as capital flows into a country driven by a mercantilist economic model. Exports good, imports bad, foreigners paying you a lot of money for your exports, capital flowing into your country, lots of capital flowing around, prices tend to rise. Inflation becomes a big problem. And as domestic prices rise, what happens? What are the incentives for domestic residents? They look at domestic prices and they say, imports look suddenly a little cheaper. Foreigners might be producing things that I can afford, and so I might be incentivized to actually purchase more imports from abroad. So in a sense, a self-defeating kind of thing. On top of that, as inflation rises at home, you end up with higher prices for your exports abroad. Foreigners suddenly find them very expensive as well. And so the conclusion that David Hume came to is that this cycle of exports good, imports bad, as underwritten by mercantilism, ultimately is a bit self-defeating because of inflation. And so you can see that here in this next slide where you sort of trace this out. If you have a mercantilist model where exports are good, imports are bad, foreigners paying you lots of money for your stuff, gold flows into your domestic economy, it tends to drive inflation up. Well, domestic prices rise, encourage foreign cheaper imports. So domestic residents look at foreign goods and say, wow, they're a lot cheaper than these domestic goods. And so you tend to want to import more foreign stuff. And so that undermines this emphasis on exports good, imports bad that underwrites mercantilism. And so it tends to reverse itself. It encourages the outflow of gold, the outflow of currency, as domestic residents, frustrated by the impact of inflation on domestic prices, want to buy foreign goods because they're less expensive. And on top of that, it's compounded by the fact that foreigners find a lot of those exports that you used to be selling them suddenly much more expensive. One of the things we might want to consider in the context of mercantilism is also efficiency, or rather the lack thereof. If we think about the neoclassical economic model for a minute, this idea of choice under constraint, or what is the most efficient allocation of resources, scarce resources for our country in terms of what we produce and how well we produce it, especially when we think about exports. How well can we produce certain things? And will foreigners want to buy them exclusively from us because we produce them so well? So think about, for example, two countries that might be producing things. Canadians, for example, we can produce wine. We do produce a little wine, but are we the best at it? What about the Spanish, for example? Do they produce snowmobiles? Well, they probably could, but are they really best equipped to produce snowmobiles given where they live, the climate, and so on? And so there are a number of things that go into these kinds of considerations around the most efficient allocation of resources and who should be producing what and where. Adam Smith gave a lot of thought to a lot of things when it came to economics, but one of them was this concept of absolute advantage in the context of international trade. And in 1776, part of his Wealth of Nations, very famous piece of economic literature, he articulated the case for trade on the basis of absolute advantage. One of the things that troubled Adam Smith about mercantilism was its tendency to confer monopolies on those that were allowed to trade. The Crown, in the pursuit of mercantilist policies of positive export balances, would often give monopoly power to specific companies to engage in trade on behalf of Britain. And so Adam Smith was troubled by this monopoly power. He saw it as incredibly inefficient. And so he puzzled over, well, what would be the basis of a more positive sum kind of allocation of resources in international trade? How could countries trade in a mutually beneficial way that would, in a sense, undermine some of that monopoly power and generate more efficiency for British productive capacities? And so absolute advantage was a way that he thought about this. And his idea was very simple. It's based on labor costs, relative labor costs. If Britain's labor costs per unit of output were less than, say, those of another country, then Britain should specialize in the production of that product where their labor costs were less on a per unit basis, specialize in that, expand the production of that product, and export it to foreigners in exchange for the product which they produced on the cheapest unit labor costs. And so it's a little bit complicated, but it's essentially a labor theory of value. So again, the idea behind absolute advantage is mostly based on labor costs. And so Adam Smith argued that trade could be mutually beneficial if, when we're talking about the production of widgets, which country can produce more widgets with fewer units of labor than another country. If you are the country that can produce them more efficiently on the basis of labor, you should specialize in that production of those widgets, and you should export those widgets to another country. And now you can see the shift here from zero-sum to positive-sum benefits when we talk about mercantilism versus absolute advantage. First of all, mercantilism obviously gives this primacy to exports. Imports are kind of bad. It treats imports as a net loss to national income. It's a zero-sum kind of trading principle in which somehow if you are losing export share and you're importing more, somehow you're losing. Somebody else's gain is your loss. But also on top of that, mercantilism has the obvious smell of colonialism connected to it. Extracting natural resources or purchasing natural resources from abroad, turning them into value-added products for re-export to foreigners. And so mercantilism has always had this smell of colonialism connected to it. The thing with absolute advantage that was so revolutionary is that it gives less primacy to exports. It says, hey, wait a minute, there is a positive sum gain to not only us as a producing country, but also to our trading partners in the sense that we can import things we don't make very well. So again, just to clarify further this idea of absolute advantage. If you as a country can produce these pencils with fewer units of labor than your competitors, then you should specialize in and expand the production of pencils and export those pencils to your foreign trading partners in exchange for goods that they perhaps produce a little bit better than you do on terms of unit labor costs, such as erasers. So you trade can be mutually beneficial. You produce and expand the production of these, and you import and reduce the production of these, all on the basis of which country can produce them more efficiently on the basis of unit labor costs. And you can see the importance or the shift from a zero-sum to positive-sum proposition in the move from mercantilism to absolute advantage. Mercantilism gives primacy to exports, treats imports as some kind of net loss to national income. Remember, exports good, imports bad. And so it's a zero-sum proposition in which somehow, if you're importing from abroad, you're exporting less and you're losing something in some fashion. And then obviously there's also the smell of colonialism connected to mercantilism. The thing with absolute advantage that is kind of revolutionary here is that it gives exports less primacy. It suggests that there is some mutual advantage to trade, and there's efficiency benefits to specializing in something that you produce very well with fewer units of labor. And so the idea that absolute advantage really holds is that trade can be a positive sum proposition. You both benefit from the production. Your trading partners benefit from the expansion of production of erasers. You benefit from this expansion and efficient production of pencils. And so you can have a mutually beneficial relationship with absolute advantage based trade. But again, it is based purely on labor costs. Now, some of you might be saying at this stage, well, absolute advantage is all well and good, but is everything really based on labor costs? Is that the basis of international trade? According to absolute advantage, sure. But is it? Well, is trade really all about labor costs? I think the politics, the popular politics, what we read about in the newspapers of international trade suggests it is. But if trade was really just about labor costs, if that was the sole component that really determined international trade, then you'd see a handful of countries with the absolute rock bottom labor costs, perhaps manufacturing everything. The thing is, if trade was really just about labor costs, you'd probably see just a handful of countries, those with the cheapest labor, cheapest wage rates, dominating international trade. Well, it's a little more complicated than that. And so Adam Smith was onto something. He demonstrated the positive sum benefits of trade, But he neglected to consider all the aspects to driving international trade. What are the real determinants of international trade? Interestingly, David Ricardo thought kind of the same thing. He wondered, why would a country with an absolute advantage in production of all kinds of goods, for example, low labor costs, why would that country want to trade with anybody? Why wouldn't they just go on making goods and exporting them and reaping the benefits of all of those exports? Why doesn't a country in our modern economy like China or Bangladesh produce absolutely everything? So if labor costs weren't the sole basis of international trade, what was the basis of trade? Well, David Ricardo advanced the ball on this argument by focusing on something called opportunity costs. He imagined two countries, both producing just two goods, pencils and erasers. Opportunity costs entail the calculation of how much of one good would you have to give up in order to produce one additional unit of another good, in this case, pencils. If your country could give up fewer units of erasers to produce more pencils than your trading partner, then you should produce more pencils. Okay, let me repeat that. The idea here is opportunity cost. How much of an eraser, how many erasers do you have to give up producing in order to produce one additional pencil? If you have to give up as a country fewer production of units of erasers to produce an additional pencil, then you should expand the production of pencils, reduce the production of erasers, and export pencils to your trading partner. Import erasers from your trading partner because you have to give up, in order to produce one more pencil, fewer units of erasers than your trading partner. And so your comparative advantage is in pencil production because you have to give up fewer units of production of erasers at home. Expand the production of pencils, export them to your trading partner, let your trading partner produce more erasers because they have to give up fewer pencils in their country to produce more erasers, meaning they have a comparative advantage in erasers. You at home have a comparative advantage in pencils, a comparative disadvantage in erasers, and your trading partner has exactly the opposite, a comparative advantage in the production of erasers and a comparative disadvantage in the production of pencils. So we come to the issue of relative efficiency again as a basis for international trade. Smith talked about the efficiency in terms of labor. Well, Ricardo comes along and talks about efficiency in opportunity cost terms, in comparative terms. How efficient is a country in producing either erasers or pencils? Well, we can think about this too in the context of perhaps Canadians producing lots of pineapples. Canadians could produce lots of pineapples, but would they do so efficiently? When you think about the infrastructure, the greenhouses, the power, the energy, all that would need to go into producing pineapples in Canada, perhaps Canada does not have a comparative advantage in the production of pineapples. So what are the implications of comparative advantage? Well, there are quite a few. Starting with thinking about which sectors of one's economy are actually competitive. So for example, if we think in comparative advantage terms about a country's trade, say the United States, for example, automobile manufacturers are not really in competition with, say, Japanese or German automobile manufacturers. It's not about a comparative advantage in trade in a single sector. In many ways, it's about determining which of your sectors has a comparative advantage or a comparative disadvantage in terms of international trade. So, for example, the American auto sector, many people sort of typically say, well, they're in competition with the Japanese or the Germans. Well, in comparative advantage terms, the American auto sector is actually conceivably in competition with American agriculture. If you think about the advantages of agriculture in the United States, there are huge advantages that it has over many countries: arable land, efficiency in production. And so in many respects, what you see is trade between Japan and the United States based on American comparative advantage in agriculture, exporting agricultural goods to the Japanese, while the Japanese send the United States lots of automobiles. So it's really not about comparative advantage or competition in particular sectors that drives international trade, but comparative advantage suggests to us which sectors have comparative advantage or comparative disadvantage. And in the United States, that competition or that determination over which sector is the area of comparative advantage, the sector in which the United States should expand its production and export the production of those products. In reality, it may actually be agriculture, not automobiles. Now, that of course presents all kinds of difficult public policy questions and decisions. Should the United States reduce its manufacturing in automobiles and expand that in agriculture? Those are challenging questions, things that we'll deal with in other parts of the study of international political economy. So just to review the Ricardian positive sum aspects of trade, they entail the expansion of production in a country's good of comparative advantage. That entails employment in that sector rising, efficiency in terms of the allocation of resources going up. You have greater product varieties because that sector of the economy is producing more stuff, greater varieties of those things. The costs go down. The unit costs in the production, the expansion of production of a particular line of products, a particular sector, unit costs fall. Learning by doing economies of scale, those reduce costs. You have technology transfer, skills development that go into that expanded sector, that sector of comparative advantage for a country as it expands to service foreign markets. Productivity goes up. Standards of living go up as you expand and export a product of comparative advantage. However, there are also some things that are a little more challenging and will probably be a little more familiar to you. And they're predicted by the economic theory, and that's the released workers. David Ricardo talked about released workers as being a consequence of the adjustment as a country moves from producing two goods, pencils and erasers, and reduces the production of erasers in favor of pencils. What happens to eraser workers? Workers that were previously employed manufacturing erasers. They don't automatically move into pencil production. It's not that straightforward. And one of the flaws of Ricardian logic or Ricardian comparative advantage is that Ricardo didn't really think too much about this. He assumed that the skills that went into producing erasers were easily transferable into the production of pencils. And that's not always the case. And so there's a lag. And when we think about that lag, when we think about that time shift where people who have lost their jobs formerly producing erasers are now looking for work, hopefully, ideally, in an expanded area of comparative advantage, the challenge is that not all of those workers automatically find jobs. If we can take this little idea just a bit further and explore a bit more about what Ricardo said, as a nation's area of comparative disadvantage shrinks, Ricardo referred to these workers that are now no longer producing erasers as released workers. He assumed that the economy would absorb those workers in the production of pencils, and he referred to them as released workers. He just assumed that these people would automatically find work in an expanded area of comparative advantage. And as we've noted, those skill sets don't automatically transfer. And so this ought to begin, or at least plant a seed in your mind about the challenges, the politics of international trade, and how the very trade theory that predicts such efficiency and the benefits, these positive sum benefits of international trade, also predicts some of the poisonous politics of international trade that flow in part from the reduction in the size, scale of the nation's product of comparative disadvantage. What do you do with those released workers if they can't automatically find their way into an area of comparative advantage? So we don't want to belabor the point too much, but I want to drive home something that's very, very important. If you take nothing away from your study of the theory behind international trade, one of the things that I would like everybody to take away is that trade creates winners and losers. And the hope with international trade, because it is a positive sum proposition and the Ricardian theory is really quite a powerful argument, albeit subtle, is that the winners are broadly distributed. The winners include the entire economy. Why? Well, in this slide, for example, you see in the winners column, you do have benefits to the overall economy. Consumer prices fall. There's a more efficient allocation of resources. There are more workers employed for longer periods of time in that area of comparative advantage as it expands and services broader global export markets. So there are more jobs, longer production runs. The broadly based benefits are to the entire economy. And so that creates a bit of a political problem because as you and I, we go and we enjoy the benefits of cheap prices, we don't automatically come up and call up our political leaders and thank them profusely for engaging in trade liberalization so that prices can fall. We just don't work that way. By contrast, if you look to the loser side of the ledger, and we think about the area of comparative disadvantage and what happens when eraser production reduces and the skill sets required to produce those erasers are no longer in demand, what happens? Well, because those skills are not so easily transferred, oftentimes the pain is very, very concentrated. So when we think about winners, they are broadly distributed throughout the economy, which is an inherent good and one of the reasons that politicians pursue trade liberalization. However, the consequences of international trade are very concentrated. The losers are very concentrated, sometimes in a single sector, sometimes in single individual factories. And if you're a member if you represent that community, you're an elected leader from that community, that creates a very difficult challenge in terms of supporting additional trade liberalization because, in a sense, you're encouraging more and more of those concentrated losers. And so that right away tells you a little bit about the divisions politically around trade liberalization and the politics of international trade. Just to reiterate a couple of these points in terms of the winners and the losers, the winners are broadly spread. And when you go to the store and you purchase something and you see, this is really, inexpensive, it came from overseas, you don't really connect the dots and say, this is the byproduct of international trade. So you don't see the benefits. The average consumer doesn't see the benefits of international trade. And even the average worker who has perhaps gone into an expanded area of comparative advantage may not automatically see their wages, their longer shifts, working hours, as connected to the global economy. The losers, however, see a direct impact. Even though trade is an important component of job loss in some narrowly concentrated areas, even some factory towns, for example, that pick up and outsource their material, their production to another country, automation, in many ways, is a much, much bigger problem for the average blue-collar worker. And there's plenty of research to back that up. But the problem is that what do you do with the concentrated losers who are displaced because of trade liberalization and the reduction of a country's area of comparative disadvantage? Well, unfortunately, government training programs, retraining programs to transfer skills from this to producing more of this are sometimes too expensive. They're also inadequate. If the skill sets in producing these items are too different, they're very difficult. It takes years of training to transfer skills producing erasers into skills producing pencils. And so that's a major challenge for governments in trying to alleviate the adjustment costs as countries rebalance from producing things of comparative disadvantage to that production of comparative advantage. And so in a very simple sense, you could say textile workers, people that produce clothing and from cotton and so on. It's very difficult to transform them into chip makers, high-tech chip makers overnight. And so this also creates a big challenge in terms of those adjustment costs to society and the politics of international trade become very poisonous, very complicated, and very fractious as a result of the fact that the very theory that touts the benefits of international trade as being a positive sum proposition for the economy as whole also creates a series of losers that are very concentrated, very potent, very motivated to organize politically. And those things become very, very challenging problems for politicians to overcome. So, to sum up, Ricardo, Smith, comparative advantage, absolute advantage, powerful arguments that were advanced to make a case for positive sum qualities of international trade. Ricardian trade is still really the basic theory upon which trade liberalization is based. The concept of trade liberalization and the benefits of trade liberalization are really based on Ricardo's idea of comparative advantage and the opportunity costs that underwrote that set of ideas. But as you can see, this is not a simple set of ideas that lends itself to sloganeering by politicians. In fact, it's the rare politician, I would be hard-pressed to point to any, that would actually stand up and defend trade liberalization these days. Both on the right and the left, it's been very, very difficult to make the case in favor of trade liberalization. And throughout the post-war period, as you've learned elsewhere, trade liberalization has become more and more difficult, particularly as we've moved from the late 1990s and into the 2000s and into the 2020s now. It's hard to find a politician that will stand on the stump and openly defend trade liberalization, partly because while on the stump, there are often very motivated, displaced workers, those released workers, those losers that the Ricardian comparative advantage predicts will be created with trade liberalization. They're standing in front of those politicians, very angry, possibly willing to throw tomatoes at those politicians. And Ricardian-based trade, comparative advantage, is a subtle argument. Powerful though it is, it's a subtle argument. You have to be quite prepared, quite well-versed in some of these arguments in order to make the case. And it's a very, very difficult thing to do when you're standing on the stump in front of a couple hundred displaced workers whose jobs are about to move to Mexico or elsewhere, and really make the argument that this is somehow good for them. And so it's a very difficult and challenging thing, and you see politicians across the spectrum, in a sense, running away from Ricardian comparative advantage. They probably understand the theory, they probably know the theory and know its power, and yet on the campaign trail, it's a very, very difficult thing to articulate and get across to publics who are very skeptical and see mostly the losers and don't automatically identify the benefits as winners.